The news folk were waiting for the next shoe to drop. You know, the protests, the violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't happen. And that's not news.
Yeah.
And that's why if anybody outside the South didn't see the first splash, they may not ever know about it.
Hi, I'm Jacquie Jordan, and this is Front and Center with Jacquie Jordan. And we are the show where the change agents, storytellers, and activators making a difference from behind the scenes take their seat front and center. I know it's been a while since you've heard from us, but we have bringing out these actual change agents and activators who are here to make a difference. And today is no different in that. I've got my new friend, Wendell Wilkie Gunn is joining us today. Wendell, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm so privileged to have you talk to us on our podcast, our broadcast podcast. Wendell, how do you compare race relations from 1963 to 2021 here in the United States?
It's an interesting question. It's one that I always hesitate to speak about because people.
Well, it's sensitive to be
it's a sensitive issue. And
ask that question.
And people get crazy about it. Let me tell you, race relations in Florence, Alabama are great. Florence, Alabama, I think the state of Alabama too, made more progress in the early 60s than people outside of the South realize. When I go to the University of North Alabama, which is my alma mater now, it looks like the barriers never existed. It looks like they never existed. But they were hard, fast barriers in 1963. In fact, my community in North Alabama really was very, very gracious in dealing with the change that occurred at that time. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, it was just a few days when I saw children playing in the park together. I went to a local steakhouse that I would be barred from before the Civil Rights Act, thinking that the service would be cool or at best cool. Took a date there. It was a great experience, and it occurred to me that it was Dale's Steakhouse. Dale Steakhouse. I said, well, my goodness, I think maybe that if I'd come in there a month earlier, Dale tried to serve me, he would have to explain to a racist neighbor sitting in there, why are you doing that? You know, why you let Black people in here? But today, he can tell that neighbor, hey, neighbor, it's the law. And he turned to me and said, may I warm your coffee, sir? So what he told me was that business didn't want Jim Crow in the first place because it cut their business in half.
Economics.
Dale wanted to sell steaks to anybody who had the money and anybody who could purchase what he had. And it made me even go back and do some research back to Plessy v. Ferguson. I said, maybe business never did want Jim Crow. And what I found was astounding. Business never did. The case that gave impetus to the spread of Jim Crow laws, Plessy v. Ferguson. They tried, and I discovered there that when they wanted to segregate people by color on the train, the railway didn't want to do that. They said that would make us have to put on extra cars so that we could put people in separate cars. They fought all the way to Supreme Court, but they lost, and Jim Crow took off.
You are a very humble man, but you are a very significant historical figure. Is that fair for me to introduce you that way, as a humble historical figure?
I just realized how insignificant one person can be.
So you have made a big significance. So just giving our listeners and our viewers a little snapshot of what we're going to be talking about in our time together is that you're from Alabama, and in 1963, at the height of the segregation, you sued the University of North Alabama when they didn't let you admit to the school. And you got into college and have gone on to be remarkably successful, happily married man, 2 successful kids, and you've made impact way beyond the initial experience that you went through getting into school. But can you talk to me a little bit about what it was like in 1963 in northern Alabama, Florence, Alabama?
That was the year that that newly elected Governor George Wallace had declared segregation forever in Alabama. It's right after the 54 Brown v. Board decision. Most of the southern states resisted desegregating their schools. But that year, I found myself in a situation where I had been going to school away from home, even though this college that I finally graduated from was only 7 miles from my home, but I never thought about going there because of Jim Crow laws. And since Jim Crow was something that I was born into, it was simply the way it was. But in the summer of '63, after finishing my first 2 years in college at Tennessee State, which was 125 miles from home, I found myself short of money to go back, because I'd been going to Tennessee State for 2 years and working in the summer to pay my expenses at Tennessee State. And that year, my summer job didn't last long enough for me to earn enough money. And Vivian Malone has already gone to the University of Alabama over the objection of Governor Wallace. And I thought that the court order that opened the door for Vivian Malone did so for all of the state schools. So I
said, you found out it didn't.
And I went right over to the college, walked into the place and said, into the registrar's office and asked for an application. The young lady said, "For whom?" I said, "Uh-oh." And after a few minutes, the registrar walks out and says, "Follow me, young man." And he walks me over to a big, beautiful office. I'd never seen an office like that. It was the office of the president. To make a long story short, to make that part of the story short, after the dean, who was also there, asked, "Who sent you here?" And I told him I just came from across the river. The president just told me that he didn't have the authority to admit, quote, a Negro.
So what prompted you to sue? And you had the full support of your family. You had 2 really beautiful, loving parents.
Well, actually, I thought that my parents would be a little upset that I had walked in there like that. But my mother just, when I told her about it, she just asked me, "Do you really want to go there?" And I was surprised, but I said, "Well, sure, I got to go someplace." She picks up the phone and calls civil rights lawyer Fred Gray, whom we all knew, but I mean, I didn't know him personally, but I knew about him because he had done the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was the lawyer for Vivian Malone at University of Alabama. And he quickly gave the phone. He quickly said, he asked me, "Do you want to go?" And I said, Well, anyway, my manhood was being challenged then. So I said, well, yeah, I got to go someplace. So we sued.
Yeah, and you sued it. You know, it was a school that was in your, 7 miles from your hometown. It's where you grew up, which is ironic. And you had, when you had shared this story with me over dinner, which I was privileged to listen to, you had said that when you won and entered the school, that you actually felt that the community gathered around you.
There were a couple of things that happened that a couple of months after we were there, George Wallace, the governor, came to the campus for Governor's Day to give a speech. And I went to that convocation because I was in the choir. Looking back, I can't believe that I was in the choir from the beginning in that situation, but I'd always participated in music, so I was in the choir. In the song that we did, I Wonder As I Wander, there was a soprano solo and a tenor solo. And I had the tenor solo, believe it or not. And I sang it with George Wallace sitting behind me, waiting to give his speech. And at the end of that convocation, he saw me standing with students, and he walked over and shook my hand. And I mean, that really shocked me too, because this is still just 4 months after he had declared segregation forever. Just a few months, I mean.
What do you think that's about? Like, what do you think that moment was about? That Governor Wallace came over and shook your hand.
I don't know.
It's beautiful, but it's what do you think that was about?
I really still don't know, but here's my guess. I learned several years later about George Wallace before he was governor. And you would not have believed that George Wallace, who was a judge at the time, would be segregationist George Wallace when he was governor. I learned, so I think he was conflicted himself. And he must have shaken my hand as a gesture. And that was sort of consistent with something that happened when he retired and he was in a wheelchair, and he entered a Black church in Montgomery to apologize for the racial stand that he had taken while he was governor. So he was a complicated man. But just to put that into a little more perspective, a lot of people don't know it, but it is on the record, it is public knowledge, that when he made his stand in the schoolhouse door at University of Alabama, and he was confronted by the Attorney General and federal marshals, he had already arranged with the Attorney General that, look, I got to give my speech, I got to fulfill my promise to stand in the schoolhouse door, and then I'm going to leave. So he gave his speech and he left. So he was a complicated figure. But I didn't understand that at the time. All I know is at the time he shook my hand, and I just said, "Thank you, sir," when he said it. But that was what that moment was about.
Did you feel protected? Did I feel
protected when I went?
Yeah, like what was the sense of being on the campus?
No, I actually, well, I tell you, if you can be unconscious walking, that's what I think I was. One day, because I had a dream about the prior to showing up, that people were coming to finish the job. I was all bandaged in this dream, and they said, "We warned you and we're coming to finish the job." And I woke up and it scared me a bit. But the thing that it told me was that once I applied and stirred it up, something could happen to me even if I backed out. So backing out became not an option at that point. It's just a question of deciding which way you're going to be walking when the bullet comes.
I think you shared with me.
And I did not want to be running. I wanted to be going forward.
And I believe that you had shared with me that of all your time in Alabama, you had never been pulled over, that your being pulled over by a cop never happened in Alabama, that it happened in
Well,
northern states.
what I said about the police was that I had been stopped. I had encounters with the police many times in the South. You know, a traffic stop here and there. But to tell you the truth, most of the time I was speeding. and at other times I was doing something that merited my being pulled over. But I never had a traumatic encounter with the police. In fact, I almost hit a policeman in Tennessee because I fell asleep at the wheel, and they stopped me and talked to me and said, and anyway, they told me to let somebody else drive because you're going to hit somebody, and I don't want it to be me. But they always let me go every time until I moved many years later to Chicago. In Chicago, I got stopped as soon as I got into town, but that's a different story. But no, my encounters with the police were never terrible. In fact, when I was 15, almost 16, I got stopped by the police for speeding, and I didn't have a driver's license. And so I got a ticket for that. But the next day I went away to school in Nashville, and my mother tried to pay the ticket. And the cop said, no, I want him in court. So when I came back home, I had to go to court. And basically what he did was gave me a tongue lashing. And because I was going to a Christian school, he said, you're studying to be a minister and you're breaking the law. Anyway, he let me go. It's the same thing that would have happened if my grandpa had been talking to me. He just gave me a tongue lashing and sent me on my way.
And today, Wendell, you serve on the board of trustees at University of Northern Alabama. Mm-hmm. How full circle is that?
I was hesitant at first to be on the board of trustees, but over the years, and you can see a lot of it in your notes. Over the years, my relationship with the school really, really developed. Because by the time I finished, things had really turned around 180 degrees. At the end of my first year, by surprise, I found out that I had earned the Physics Achievement Award, which means the top honors in the field of physics. It shocked me because I didn't know how anybody else was doing because we weren't talking. This was in the spring of my first year. And when I got up to receive the award, there was a spontaneous applause, and the whole gathering stood up and cheered, and I just lost my composure. There might have been tears, but I don't like to admit it, but I'm sure there were tears. And it lasted about 4 or 5 minutes. I was in a state of shock. And at the end of that convocation, students and faculty gathered around me to congratulate me personally. And that was the day that I said, not everybody white is out to get me. You know, it was an amazing moment that I feel every time I tell it, even now 50 odd years later. I didn't realize how much tension I had been carrying inside up to that time until it just released. And after that, I was pretty much just another student. which is all I wanted in the first place.
You also talked to me about that in terms of your work career. You went on to the University of Chicago and really you studied finance. You worked for Chase Bank in Manhattan.
And that's another thing about, and each one of these things had something, there was still a connection back to my school. I went to the University of Chicago and I got the most amazing recommendation from my organic chemistry professor at Florence State. In fact, I was there when his letter was read by the dean. He read it out loud to me. He read part of it out to me, and the last line in it was, "Your school, your institution will be proud to have this young man as a graduate." That was pretty amazing. Anyway, I think that was largely responsible for my getting into a top tier school of business like the University of Chicago.
Well, you also have to be very smart to do that. That doesn't happen just because of a letter. You actually have to be very, very smart to get into the University of Chicago.
Well, maybe, but I was always hesitant to view myself as smart because I was just doing the best I could. I didn't know how well I was doing until way later, looking back.
What was way later? Well, define that moment when you realized, what was the way later?
You know, when you grow up in segregated circumstances with other people controlling your educational stuff, and you don't know what's happening on the other side of the track. I always felt that I was intelligent enough, but I felt that maybe the people on the other side were a bit more advanced, and maybe they had better. Well, I know they had better facilities, et cetera, and I thought maybe they were getting a better education. That's all. So I was always a little insecure when I crossed another threshold.
Sure.
But then learned that, hey, not that I was smart, but that ordinary people come in all kinds of colors. And ordinary people can achieve extraordinary stuff. So I don't have to be brilliant to achieve. If I'm, all I have to do is be smart enough to work hard enough,
And we talked about you were in the workforce during affirmative action.
Yes.
How is that in terms of exactly what you're talking about, not knowing whether you're good enough?
Well, that's quite frankly, I mean, I was happy that affirmative action came along. What I figured affirmative action meant was casting a wider net, looking for qualified people to do a particular job. But then when it started to turn into quotas, I wondered if when I was being hired or being sought by somebody, whether they were looking for me for the color of my skin so that they could get their numbers okay, but putting me into a job that I could only go so far in. It was just a bit scary. So when I didn't have that problem in business school because I ended up in business school helping tutoring a number of people that I thought were more advanced than I was, and they weren't. But when I went to Chase Bank had the most vigorous credit training program of any major bank. It was tough. And I did very well in that program. In fact, I went through it with the highest performance rating in the history of the bank. Wow. And I did not believe that I was better than anybody who had ever come to the bank. It scared the daylights out of me that I was being set up for a fall. I left there with an ulcer. I mean, I um, uh, um, and went to Texas Southern to teach. There, I ran across a number of Black professors that I was impressed with. I thought they were brilliant. And I learned that they were impressed with me as we got to know each other. So then that just gave me a kind of a better sense of where I stood compared to people I admired.
Right.
So when Chase Bank, who kept after me to come back, when they brought me back, and they did, they persuaded me, I had a different attitude. And I was more productive than I thought I would ever be. The things that I did not only brought business to the bank, but helped change the bank's procedures for doing a number of important things. So, well, you know.
Big impact.
I just had to know for myself.
Right.
How I compared to others.
Right.
Yeah, you got to
measured on value. Measured on value.
Because if you can take yourself too seriously and think that you're so smart, you just set yourself up for a fall.
Right.
But basically, I just kept trying things and surprising myself at my own success, if you know what I mean.
It's almost like your trajectory of adulthood really was in sync with the changes. You know, born into Jim Crow segregation, all you know, breaking down the barrier at University of Northern Alabama, which at the time was University of Florence,
Mm-hmm.
Going on to University of Chicago, starting at Chase Bank during, being there for affirmative action, having to experience, whether it's, is it quota or is it value, and sorting that out for yourself. And then you went on to make a big contribution through the presidency, the White House administration. Can you talk about that?
That was another case of my wandering into something I didn't know anything about.
We call that destiny. we call that destiny.
My work life has always been in the private sector, except for the time when I got lured into working in the White House. What had happened was a few years earlier, I had run into an economist named Arthur Laffer. He was a professor at the University of Chicago. I didn't take his class, but I sat in his class a couple of times. I didn't know what he was talking about. He talked too fast. But I ran into him again about 3 years after I left Chicago, had an argument with him, which I lost. I mean, I lost it.
I find that hard to believe.
Huh?
I find that hard to believe.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. But when you lose one, I love the arguments that I lose, because that means I know something I didn't know before the argument. Those are the ones I really like. You wouldn't believe it given how vigorously I argue. But anyway, I got to know him, and he had a big impact from that point, on my view of economics. That was very different from what I had even after I had left the University of Chicago. And I think he must have been one of Reagan's early advisors. And I think what he did was he recommended to the Republican Platform Committee in 1976 that I testify on economic policy, particularly tax policy. And my ideas really came from what John Kennedy did in 1961 about taxes, and his notion that a rising tide lifts all boats. And he instituted a big tax cut policy, a tax cut initiative Of course, he wasn't around to see it through. And so LBJ put it through after Kennedy died.
Can you give me a snapshot of what your economic policy or your economic belief was around taxes? What's a snapshot of that?
I believe if you tax something, you'll get less of it. And if you subsidize something, you'll get more of it. And when the government raises tax rates, it doesn't get all of the tax revenue that it expected because it forgets about how people adjust their portfolios, because people really work for after-tax income. They don't work to pay taxes. And so an unintended consequence of tax increases is sometimes activities go into the underground economy. And in the free flow of capital in the world, production can shift to another place, another state, another city, another country. So you have to take that's summed up in something called the Laffer curve, if you've ever heard of it. Anyway, I was convinced that this made sense. And John Kennedy was very successful when he cut the tax rates. And during the early 70s, the economy really grew fast. No. In the 60s, it grew really fast after he did it. So I was trying to get, but at the time, Jim Crow was still in place. So white people were prospering, but we were still being discriminated against. So I went to the Republicans and said, you got to do what John Kennedy did. Now that the civil rights fight is over against discrimination, and then you can cause tax rates to grow, cause the economy to grow, and that helps people, whether they're black or white, or it even makes segregation more expensive, if you know what I mean. So I recommended that to the Republican Platform Committee, and the word got back to Ronald Reagan so that when he got ready to run next time, apparently Laffer had talked to him, said, you better get Gunn in here. Okay. And I got invited to join the administration. I didn't want to. I told them no over and over. And finally, one of them asked me to just come in and meet us. And I met the senior staff, but at the end of the day, I said no. And they walked me into the president's office, and the president got up and said, "Welcome aboard," and I was stuck.
You don't say no, right, to Ronald Reagan?
You know, the Oval Office is overwhelming. Yeah. I wasn't even thinking about the politics of it because I was never interested in politics, but I'm always interested in economics.
Did you get backlash for participating?
I'm sorry?
Did you receive backlash from either peers, friends, colleagues?
Well, no. I mean, maybe I would have if I had been politically active. But what I got was, well, you know, politics is about power, and I was about.
Well, right. I call politics about indoctrination, but business is about economics.
You've got to look at the total impact of what you do and not just the intended impact.
Absolutely.
And it comes down to unintended consequences. That's all.
As I'm a business owner, and I work with a lot of business owners, and you can't spend more than you earn. I mean, it's just, I'm for my professional advocacy is for business solvency. So it's very hard for me to be part of an economy, government, or state that does not operate in economic solvency.
Well, think about business. Think about your business. Literally, a lot of people think business is large companies. No, it isn't. Business is whenever two people come together and trade on terms that are acceptable between them, business is happening. So you can't be anti-business and be pro-people. Now,
right.
that doesn't mean that people who run big businesses are always in favor of good business policy, because the ones that get hurt the most from it are small businesses who are trying to become big. The big ones like to protect themselves from the upstarts. I'm sure that if IBM could have, they would have stopped Microsoft years ago, you know. But that's not what they would have stopped. Stephen Jobs. And but you've got to always have fertile ground for people who want to do business, and that's especially small businesses, starting businesses, to grow.
You know, I have remodeling a house in Tennessee, and we had a serviceman come to the door, and he was standing outside waving to people he knew that was passing by, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, Jacquie," he said, "us in the South have settled our differences. It's you city folk that keeps stirring it up." And I just, you know, it's kind of what I hear you saying is, you know, it's
that is so true. That is so true. I would rather live in Florence, Alabama than Chicago. I'd rather live. As a matter of fact, if my children did not live in the Northeast, they're in Brooklyn and, you know, and Cambridge.
And you got your grandson there too.
Yeah, I would be in Alabama. I would have moved to Alabama. In fact, we had plans to move to Alabama already in motion when they put my grandson in my hand in the hospital. I turned to my wife and said, "We're not leaving, are we?" She said, "No."
You have it left. Wendell, we have just a couple minutes left, and you had referred in the very beginning of this conversation, and I wanted to tap the wisdom, but you had said that from the viewpoint that you stand in today, when you look back at your past, especially in 1963 and getting into school, it has a different perspective. Can you summarize or paint that picture for us?
Well, it suddenly occurred to me, looking back, that I did not. Well, somebody asked me, how could it happen at that time? And why didn't I know about it? Well, and I realized that I can answer the last question, but I couldn't answer the first. I said, how did it happen? Because I became even more aware of what was happening in various parts of the South 50 years ago. So I said, well, I don't know the answer to that question. So I went home and I started doing some research to find out what was happening behind the scene that made my experience there overall successful. So I found out that the president he had seen what had happened at the University of Alabama. He had seen what happened there twice, 1956, et cetera. And he prepared to make sure that it didn't happen that way at that campus. And I found out that he had enlisted the football team to look out to make sure that nothing happened. And all they wanted to be able to do it with somebody who didn't come with an organization, a big, and I just happened to walk in there myself alone. And I think what happened was they were waiting for me. And I didn't know who I was, didn't know where I'd come from, but somebody who came alone without an agenda except they wanted to go to school. And they said, this is our chance to do it our way.
Right.
And Fred Gray wasn't even looking at a regional school like mine. He was probably looking at Auburn next, because that's another big school. But we approached him, and all of a sudden he had a plaintiff for this school because he couldn't solicit, and the president of the school had an applicant. I still haven't double checked, but I'll bet you they got together and said, we can do this deal without a lot of noise. And that's exactly what happened in 1963.
We're there. A man of destiny, a man whose life has been, in my opinion, in my witnessing, governed by destiny. Wendell, thank you so much for joining us here on Front and Center and sharing your story. And I look forward to your autobiography being published.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.